And thank you for attending. This is the first of our faculty lecture series this year. I'm excited to be here and talk to you about, honestly, the facet of landscape architecture that I find the most personally rewarding and inspiring, and that is planting design. And as my plant students will tell you, some of them are out there in the audience, that I can talk a long time about plants, so or planting design. So buckle your seatbelts. I also really enjoy kind of telling people, they're often curious about, what the job is like being a professor and someone who teaches about plants. And I like to say that I get paid to walk around and talk about plants. So what could be better? Their natural origin and associations and ways to use them in design. I'm really proud to be here in the CED and honored to be a part of a program that really from its inception has been one that has championed plants knowledge and creative planting design. I never met Hubert Owens or Bob Hill or others, but I'd like to think that I'm part, along with other faculty, in continuing in what they envisioned. I wonder what they would think about the state of the profession today and planting design in particular. So the heart of the lecture tonight will be about, I need to get my clicker going here. It's going to be about some meta research that I've been working on for several years now. And so I realized the title of the lecture is a bit broad, and so I'm not going to cover everything that could possibly relate to sustainable practices in planting design for the Southeast. I'm going to eventually narrow down to really the meta research, and you have a sneak peek of that here. And I do want to spend a few minutes in the beginning here on what I'm afraid I might call my typical soapbox on the critical importance of planting design to the profession and education of landscape architects. And then I'll define what I mean by planting or ecological planting design in this lecture, and then discuss meadow design for the Southeast in our early research. And then I'll talk a little bit about our project at Exit 6, which is underway, and how that kind of ties in. So I think planting design has never been more exciting. Projects like this park and playground in the Olympic Village in Vancouver, British Columbia, exemplify what I would consider among the best in naturalistic or nature-inspired ecological planting design. Native, and in this case, some introduced plants as well, are used to provide much needed ecological function, stormwater cleaning and filtering, habitat creation, and simultaneously beauty to the human eye. This is planting design that takes its cues from natural systems and function while infusing human function and needs and the human desire for beauty. It does it all. Another example is Tongva Park in Santa Monica, California. And these images are collected on our East and West Coast field trips. So it's a delightful opportunity to see what's happening in the field. This is a project done by James Corner, Field Operations, but in close concert with California plantsman John Greenlee. So he's the local expert. It accomplishes the same objectives of civic beauty and function. Tongva Park connects City Hall with Santa Monica's Beachview Main Street. It's quite a beautiful place. On land adjacent City Hall that was formerly a rundown parking lot. So now the California native landscape, with some augmentation of non-native plants, has been reinserted into the daily lives and consciousness of the people there. And I have to say that I guess I've become a skeptic somewhat. Before visiting these places, I often think it's not going to be as good as it was written about in Landscape Architecture magazine or of some of the sort of hype. And in each of these cases, I've been more than impressed. It's truly magnificent work. And in our own backyard, so to speak, one of my favorite examples to share with prospective BLA students and their families when they visit, often they're from perhaps North Georgia, the metro Atlanta area, is Fourth Ward Park. I'm sure a lot of you have been here. Designed by Wood & Partners for the overall master plan with detailed site design and planting design by our friends at H-Score, Hughes Good, O'Leary, and Ryan, and the very talented Steve Sanchez. So a wonderful example of function and I think native wild beauty altogether. So I'm pretty convinced that part of our challenge as landscape architects in educating the world on the value of landscape architecture can actually be found in our collective reluctance sometimes to accept the mantle of planting designer. You might wonder what I mean. This issue is subtle, but it plays out over and over in practice and in education. In practice, the demands of clients overwhelm, sometimes with development strategies stuck in past models, lacking a land ethic and a philosophy that we are better off making places that save and celebrate wildness. I know this struggle very well from my own years in practice in Florida and Tennessee. I think it also happens when we all have to explain, maybe for the 100th time, that no, we don't actually mow lawns, usually. And in fact, we should all reduce the amount of lawn in our communities if we want to save our environment and ourselves. So the canyon of misunderstanding that is embodied in this conversation represents the challenge we face in advancing societal understanding of the value of our work. Too much of the time in practice, I think it is easier to align, I may get some comments on this, with planning and urban design, and to disassociate with anything having anything to do with plants so as to avoid being categorized as somehow merely gardeners, or insert whatever title you'd like there. To further confuse the issue, too much of our work has perpetuated the norm, so that our fellow citizens cannot see and have no opportunity to see examples that might show the way to a better future. This is changing, however, and I think these examples I've briefly shown are encouraging, and they show how very unique our position is as a landscape architect. No other profession possesses the combination of skills and knowledge that we do to order and arrange ecological and human function and beauty to the human eye. We must never forget how our work with living systems sets us apart from other design, engineering, and architectural professions. So this sort of strange trio of images is meant to convey, although somewhat disparate, the tensions between satisfying the human desire for order and symmetry and formality, like the pool image in the upper left. I'm realizing I didn't dim the lights. Is that better? And intentionally wild-looking landscapes, another example from recent practice on the bottom, that's Brooklyn Bridge Park, just across from South Manhattan. Beautiful design by Michael Van Valkenburg and Associates. And then the everyday suburban landscapes, like the orange roofed building here, which you might recognize from just down the road on Broad Street, across from Beach Haven Church. So how do these relate? As weird as it sounds, I think the folks in the suburban landscape here are in some ways trying to achieve what is seen in the upper left image there, this sense of formality and control over the landscape. And the truth is, I think people really don't know exactly what to do otherwise. And they maybe could not even begin to create the kinds of landscapes like the ones I've shown or the one in the bottom without the help of our profession. Our former dean, Daryl Morrison, well known for his naturalistic and ecologically friendly planting design, writes that people will change, they just need to see it on the ground and believe it. This is a complex problem. The successful articulation of a design favoring native and sometimes messy looking plants requires careful study of how to provide enough form and enough structure to communicate to the viewer and the user that it is actually intentional, that it's beautiful, desirable, and worth caring for. And today we understand these design frameworks and language much better because of the insightful work of Joan Nassauer in her 1995 article, Messy Ecosystems, Orderly Frames. I now regularly require my students in plant ID or planting design to read Bringing Nature Home by Douglas Tallamy. Dr. Tallamy. He's an entomologist at the University of Delaware. I don't know a better book for explaining the connections between design and management and plant selection of our landscapes and healthy ecosystems, and thus a healthy planet for the future. The facts and figures he presents on the damaging impacts of turf and our use of turf across the nation are staggering. He writes that we have converted nearly 40 million acres of land in the United States, that's 8 times the size of New Jersey, to sterile, basically a plant system that's on life support. It supports no forms of life, essentially. So if we're going to mow less, and this is where I'm headed with really my meadow research, if we're going to mow less, if we're going to do better plant communities, then what do we do? What is the solution? How do we decrease our dependence on turf? So the truth is, it's really difficult to see and understand all of the connections. I think it's actually increasingly difficult for each generation as we're increasingly removed from the farm and the practice of gardening and growing things. This might seem like a strange place to go in this lecture. But for our students, if you have never planted a garden from seed, labored and sweat and worked and gotten a sore lower back, broken the soil and managed insect and weed and pest pressure to obtain a few fruits for your own consumption, then how can you fully understand the relationship between the garden, healthy plant communities, healthy everyday landscapes, healthy insect populations, and so on? And then how can you adequately value the resources necessary to grow food, or understand why we as a society have become so dependent on chemicals and for food growing operations, for turf management, for landscapes of all type? And I think at a basic level, we as humans go to great lengths to avoid manual labor, but what is the long-term cost? Wendell Berry writes that one of the most important resources that a garden makes available for use is the gardener's own body. A garden gives the body the dignity of working in its own support. It is a way of rejoining the human race. There's a lot of meaning wrapped in that statement, but I think what Wendell is saying is that we understand the interconnections of all of these things in a much deeper way, and we can understand as landscape architects how our work relates to the collective whole. So the slide I'm showing you is the last couple of times I've taught planting design. To try and make this point, I've required students to keep a garden at UGarden. UGarden's a wonderful facility here on campus. And it might be one of the greatest things I've ever done as a teacher. The students are skeptical at first, but write in a really beautiful way about the power of the exercise by the end of the semester. So to help achieve this goal, for a while, I've been working on a book with Professor David Nichols. So shameless plug here for upcoming publication. And I don't think David is here tonight. He's actually giving a tour of the Founders Garden as he's the director there. But we're delighted to share that the book is now in press and should be out in the spring or summer. We cover everything from trees to shrubs, perennials, grasses, sedges, everything that we need to consider as designers for doing planting design. It's meant to serve as a user-friendly palette book for anyone doing planting design. We do emphasize natives. We also cover non-invasive introduced plants. And the book is a pretty significant departure from the typical horticultural text that tends to list plants alphabetically. And instead, it's organized by design criteria and natural association. So we're excited for that to be nearly done. So I want to return for just one more minute to this idea of seeing what needs to be done on the ground. One of my thesis students a few years ago was really interested in this question and wondered if visitors to these more ecologically inspired planting designs had any idea what they're looking at and how they perceived these landscapes aesthetically. So this is Andrew Spatz. He's now gainfully employed in Knoxville, Tennessee. He traveled to the High Line in New York City and did user questionnaires. And in January, of all times of year, I was afraid it would be a terrible failure based on wintertime. But New Yorkers are out no matter what. So out of more than 70 participants, an overwhelming majority found it to be a beautiful and desirable landscape and one they would like to see repeated in other places. And so Andrew asked a lot of questions targeted at the use of grasses in this planting design, and specifically about the winter appearance. And users reported preferring the uncut appearance of the grasses, and they were surprisingly articulate in their understanding of the value of the plantings to pollinators and local ecosystems. I think that's especially relevant here in the Southeast, where we have quite an aggressive plant palette, a long growing season, and I'll talk a bit about that more in just a bit. And some images of the highline in summer, another remarkable plant design. Similarly, the Lurie Garden, very famous now by Pete Udolph and GGN. Example of wild nature in the city, or at least the feeling of that. And this happens to be in Rabun County, just up the road on 441. Notice the Exxon in the distance there. But this is in front of a lighting store of all places, and done by the Folkley Garden Group out of Gainesville, Georgia. Excellent company. It could be that I've been thinking about this way too much, probably, but the tug of war between formal and habitat unfriendly landscape and habitat supportive landscapes has been playing out right here on campus as well. Maybe you've observed changes to North Campus and the Quad. And over the last few years, the Special Collections Library, and some of you may not have been on campus long enough to see, but the library landscape is really pretty remarkable. It's native plants, it's a series of stormwater gardens that surround the library. On the east side of the library, the original planting included a really large swath of purple lovegrass, and I don't have an image of that plant for you, but it's a low-growing native, purple flowering somewhat in the summer. And I was surprised to see it used because it definitely began to kind of push maybe over the line of messy to orderly. And just a couple of years after installation, the plant was performing just perfectly, but it was all removed. And I haven't done a survey, I haven't asked anybody on UGA grounds to find out why it was removed, but I speculate there was an order from somewhere to get rid of that untidy mess. So an example of the struggle between ecosystem supportive and orderly landscapes. So embedded in this work I've been showing is the obvious need to be very good at plant selection. One must understand ecological fit and performance over time. How will each species perform in relation to others? How must the design be managed over time? What is the visual quality of each plant in each season? And will it contribute to a sense of order and intentionality? Must all of the plants be native? Is there value to the careful use of non-native material, especially in urban context where non-native material has naturalized for so long, there's no longer any semblance of the original pre-human, pre-settlement plant community. When the aesthetic quality of the planting is key, and it always is in public landscapes, does this warrant the use of introduced plants if they greatly increase the aesthetic value of the composition? And I have a little short video here of you of pollinator activity. This is a plant in my own personal garden, and if anyone can ID it, I owe you an ice cream cone. If you know the plant, just shout it out. No. No. It looks like a lot of things, doesn't it? So this is about a 30-second video, and I counted over 75 various pollinators visiting the plant. A really high level of activity. I've only observed this level of activity on a couple of other plants, such as devil's walking stick in flower, and buttonbush in flower, great natives. So I don't want to create a raging debate tonight at the end of my lecture, but this is not a native plant. This is a plant from China and East Asia called Petrinia. Dangerous. It's not known to have invasive tendencies. Stephen and Rachel Kaplan, environmental psychologists, have written extensively on the therapeutic value of nature and write in their attention restoration theory, or ART, that urban environments are particularly taxing on one's ability to maintain focus and directed attention and to complete tasks and work productivity because of the constant stimuli required by the urban environment and voluntary attention. Access to nature, in contrast, provides relief because it activates a different part of the brain, involuntary attention. I theorize that some of these wild and naturalistic designs in urban environments are particularly successful because of the incredible contrast to the urban environment. And conversely, it may be that naturalistic designs for more rural and suburban areas need a lot more structure or cues, as Nassauer would put it, to signal to the viewer that the design is in fact intentional, and maybe no mowing is actually needed. These are difficult questions, and they require extensive research and knowledge built over time. In planting design that mimics natural plant communities, plant density is very high. So we're not talking about traditional block plantings or carefully composed drifts of shrubs and perennials in mass. Planting design to mimic natural systems needs a species richness and diversity that is difficult to achieve without using seeds as a mechanism for establishment. Seeds, just by nature of their small size, allow for distribution ease and of many species within just 1 square yard or even 1 square foot. So this really leads us to what I would call now the application part of tonight's lecture about our meadow research at Yew Garden and now in other locations. And so the question I keep coming back to in my own research is, how do we create and manage landscapes that are better for the future, particularly in replacement for mowing? I want to be sure to thank and recognize a lot of project partners over the years. Dr. John Calabria for his expertise in research methods and statistics, Professor Brian Orland for financial support and for his expertise in visual perception, Dr. Eric McDonald for use of his field survey equipment frequently, numerous graduate students and undergraduate students. Without you, this project would not be where it is. And in particular, Sean Dunlap. I don't know if Sean made it tonight. Sean's in practice in the area. Sean wrote with myself and Professor Orland the original request for funding to the UGA Office of Sustainability, which paid for the initial setup, material purchases, and installation of our project at Yew Garden. And then most recently, grad student Matt Query has been working on our Exit 6 project, and I'll talk about that at the end and explain his new title down there. I also want to thank Professor David Burley and the farm manager at Yew Garden, Johanna Byang, for their continued support and tolerance of our project out at Yew Garden. Sarah Hutchison, Alan McDonald, Brandon Platt, Deborah Kim. I'm going to miss some of you, but thank you for all of your help. And we need more. So Sean's started out in the MLA program and actually finished in the MEPD. And I just want to mention his great practicum. It's really exemplary, in which he used GIS to identify, related to our study, what are other places in Clark County where Piedmont prairie would be suitable. He identified more than 318 acres of prime area where hypernatural Piedmont prairie could be installed. It's a really great long-term planning document. I also want to really thank and give credit to Dr. James Hitchmo and his more than 30 years of research in seeded approaches which sets the foundation for new work, especially here in the Southeast in our own meadow study. So these images are borrowed from Dr. Hitchmo of his work, and this is, I believe, at a private residence outside of London. And interestingly, you may recognize in this photo some familiar plants. This is actually almost completely a mix of Eastern US native species. Liatris, Rudbeckias of various kinds, Silphium, rattlesnake master, Echinacea pallida. So he's basically stolen our plant palette from the Southeast and is using it there to great effect. And so these images show a 5-year progression of one of his meadow installations. And I'll explain in just a moment his kind of novel approach to establishment. So year 1, seeding, in this case, kind of a jute erosion control fabric over the top. And I just want you to see the progression from year mid-season year 1. This is actually at the end of season 2, heavy annual presence the first year or 2. And then this gives time for perennials to begin to fill in and take their place into years 3 and 4 and 5 and then beyond. So this approach is, in Dr. Hitchmo's approach, is quite the opposite of what you learn as good horticulture, what most of us learn. Soil is not typically amended. It's left in its current or natural condition. Usually it's turned or aerated. It's topped by a 2 to 3 inch layer of a mineral material. This can be sand or finely ground construction rubble if it's nearby available, or various quarried materials. And the word quarried is important because you don't want to substitute river sand or a material that's going to have seed or native or a weed seed bank present in it. So you want a clean material. This creates a somewhat hostile environment, but with fall sowing in particular, the seed is able to germinate in early spring and establish roots into the soil below before hot weather arrives. This sort of grit layer acts as a weed blanket, sort of like the black stuff you might buy from a big box store, but much better. And this kind of buys you 1 to 2 years of a weed-free zone to allow all of the desirable species to fill in. So once the ground is covered, the community becomes fairly stable and can last for many years. And so many publications by Hitchmo and his PhD students, but this one in particular we used as kind of the basis for our own study at UGarden to kind of use as a benchmark and to see if we would get similar results. And to kind of explain the kind of research context and results, the factors being tested here were sand or grit blanket compared with just regular soil, burning versus mowing or sort of a bush hog type management regimen, and also a spring sowing versus fall. And in green, you see there the best results. So using the grit blanket, sowing the seed directly into the top of that, burning wherever possible, and a fall seed installation produced the best results. So the context here and other places for meadow aesthetics is that the public desires a very high forb content, flowers. This is easily seen here in Georgia and the Southeast by GDOT, which has a very successful wildflower program, and they're one of our partners in the Exit 6 project. But if you examine what they put out for the wildflower program, it's annual cosmos and sometimes zinnias and basically annuals that are not native to the United States. And this is because they get great results. It's showy, it's colorful, it's beautiful, and the public responds to that. So our project seeks to look for a native and a perennial alternative that could possibly have a similar visual quality. Plants and plugs are expensive. Seed is more cost effective, but the exact establishment regimen for each ecoregion is very poorly understood. Existing approaches to meadow establishment typically favor grasses, especially here in the United States. And I'll show an example of that in a second. And the problem with that, and sometimes this doesn't resonate in the landscape architecture crowd, we like grasses, but often the public sees those as weedy and undesirable. So they don't quite perceive them the same way. Local site and region-specific mixes are very much needed. And our problem in the Southeast is that many of our native meadows tend to be 5 to 8 feet tall by mid-July. This is kind of oppressive. It's too tall, it's overwhelming. And so the need in research is to develop mixes that stay lower than this. Otherwise, out comes the bush hog. And so I don't mean to pick on Ernst Conservation Seed. They're a wonderful company and really doing great work. But I did want to show as an example, this is their Georgia Upland Piedmont mix. So very targeted here for us. But if you examine this, and I'm sure you can't read those words from where you are, but you'll have to trust me. If you add all of this up, this mix is greater than 80% grasses. And so what you actually get if you install this seed mix in the Southeast is mostly a grassy looking meadow, not much forb or flower content. And that is going to leave a lot of people unhappy with the result, depending on their maybe understanding of what's going on. So our study at U Garden is set up modeled after Hitchmo's study, 32 plots, 2 seed mixes, A and B, 2 soil types, one just clay, the other with the grit or sand, or in this case, granite fines blanket, and 2 management types, mow versus burn. Yes, they're letting us burn out at U Garden. And the seed mix strategy involves thinking about the seed mix in a lot of different ways. First, architecturally, how is each plant contributing to the mix in terms of its form and texture and visual presence? Layering is very important. A diverse root morphology. And then looking a bit more at ecology and plant growth and change over time in Grimes theory. Most plants can be considered somewhere on the CSR triangle, meaning that they are either a competitor, or the S for stress tolerator, or R for a ruderal plant. Most of Hitchmo's mixes really try to single in on the S, on stress tolerators. These are plants that are stable over the long term in a mix. In one of our mixes at U Garden, we're experimenting with a little bit more of an emphasis on competitors. And that's why the note here is competitors, but not warmongers. Competitors that maybe have a chance at fighting against some of our typical aggressive, competitive, weedy grass species here in the Southeast. And we're having some interesting preliminary results. Borrowed from Rayner and West, their book, Planting in a Post-Wild World. This kind of shows you the idea of the architectural and structural layering. Rayner was here a couple of years ago talking about this, but it's basically the same strategy of a ground cover layer, a matrix across the bottom, a seasonal theme layer in the middle. That's where most of the flowering occurs. And then a delicate structural layer, some form that sticks above at the top. And then a diagram to think about root morphologies. And to be honest, I have a little bit of trouble with this diagram. Maybe I'm taking it too literally. But if you're going to label species, I kind of expect the drawings to be totally accurate. So I need to email Thomas, but he'll love that, I'm sure. But some of these root drawings in particular don't really depict what happens with these particular species. So maybe it doesn't quite convey the message as strongly as it could. But the idea is the same above ground as below, really, is that the plants occupy a different space. Either they're deep rooted or they have spreading roots, and above ground, are they thin and upright, or are they low and bushy? And so there's three-dimensional space for all of them to fit together. So too much text for a good PowerPoint slide, I realize, but I wanted you to see how some of these layers of thinking play out in our seed mix. And so this is the mix A, the Piedmont mix. And here we're looking at the mix in terms of structural versus seasonal theme and ground cover layer. And notice the emphasis on the seasonal theme layer. So it's all about trying to get as much flowering as possible. And blue indicates the species we've had the most luck with, the most success in terms of germination and actual presence now in what is the third growing season of the study. And same thing for mix B. In this case, the red is a special designation for those competitor species that I mentioned. And so the two we chose for this study were Phlox pilosa and Oenothera speciosa. And great results from the Oenothera or Oenothera. And then just looking at the mix again and thinking about seasonality. It's a great way to examine for yourself in any mix, you know, what do we have happening in each season? What's the potential for some kind of visual interest from spring, summer, winter, and fall? And similarly for mix B. So just a quick show of kind of the progression of the study. We began in the summer of 16 with prep. And so this was the site as we got started out there at UGard. And you can see this driving by on South Millage. And we tilled the soil, turned the sod under, and then covered in plastic. We used black plastic in this case. Clear actually works better. We solarized the ground for about 8 weeks, which was pretty effective, although I'll reveal one of the flaws in just a minute. So this is a truthful presentation. Initial construction of the boxes, filling them with the regular Georgia red clay soil that was piled by UGA grounds just behind UGarden and available for use. And lots of student volunteers here. And randomly assigned application of the granite fines to boxes within this sort of block of 32 blocks. These are 8-foot squares. Prepping, and then finally planting. There's Mr. Dunlap on the left. And highly, it seems like an odd way to install, but with this size of boxes, we actually divided the seed into equal portions and stood on each side of the row of boxes and hand cast the seed. So hand cast as evenly as you can manage by hand, and then just a light, gentle raking in over the top just to make sure you have good contact between the seed and the soil, or in the fines in this case. And this is done in Hitchmo's work on sites that range up to 3 or 4 acres in size, with a team of people spread across the site, working systematically from one end to the other. We're, of course, looking at other methods for our roadside work. Obviously, that can't be done on a massive scale, so we're looking at techniques to use either a broadcast spreader or perhaps even drill seeding to apply the seed. There are limitations with that. The variation you get in seed sizes in the mix is a big problem with distribution. Okay, so here's the moment of truth. This looks abysmal, doesn't it? So by the end of season 1, what we did not account for, and I should know this having lived in the Southeast my whole entire life, was the incredible edge pressure from Bermuda and other aggressive species. So what should have been our underlayer of lower, bushier plants in the mix ended up being Bermuda and nutsedge. So I'm not supposed to show you this. This is like too honest. But what was encouraging was still the great presence of desirable species. In this case, you're seeing Coreopsis and young Silphium and some other species kind of hiding in the Bermuda there. So what this has evolved into in this study is a look at how these species can compete in lower management areas where weed pressure is going to be extreme. This is actually very valuable information for places like roadsides and utility corridors where it's not going to be feasible to spread hundreds of acres of sand or granite fines across vast amounts of acreage. And here we have some hardworking graduate students helping with plant counts. So in the field, we've been doing quadrat sampling and pin drop tests to look at numbers of plants and also plant density over time. And we've sampled 1 to 2 times each year for the last 3 years. And then the fun part, John may not want to be seen burning. I don't know if he's in the room. But we were able to burn half of the plots as part of our management regimen. And students got to participate in this. You may see yourself up here. It goes quick. There's Sarah in this past year. And finally, though, you might not believe that this happened, but in year 2, the results were actually pretty good. Across the plots, the May and June presence, visual presence, is really pretty good. This is Coreopsis and the evening primrose. So this is primarily mix B you're looking at in flower. So not bad in late spring and early summer. We've got architectural interest here this is Rudbeckia maxima, and then Silphium perfoliatum coming up there. Those will be in bloom later in the summer. So this is another month later. This is late June, early July. And now we have Echinacea and the Rudbeckia maxima in flower. Close-ups of the Echinacea and the Silphium. And if you go out there now, today, the plant that's heaviest in bloom are the Silphiums. So it's a tall matrix of yellow flowers at the moment. Another July image. This is one of the Monardas, Monarda punctata, and a few other species in bloom there. Rattlesnake master up close, wonderfully architectural plant, provides structure in the mix. And this was just a couple of weeks ago. So a lot of interesting forms, but truthfully, a mix that's too tall for a lot of places, especially public parks and public landscapes, but probably has great potential for roadsides and utility corridors. So to kind of summarize the results, the early weed pressure was certainly not our intent, but the plant performance under weed pressure has offered an interesting study very applicable to many potential future sites like roadsides, utility and transit corridors, and more rural sites where a native mix is desired in place of traditional non-native grass mixes. The silver lining of the study is the persistence and excellent performance, in particular, of the deep-rooted, tall structural plants, such as the Silphiums, Rudbeckia maxima, Retivita pinnata, and the Asclepias, the butterfly weed, which I wasn't able to show you a photo with butterfly weed in bloom, primarily because the monarch butterfly larvae pressure was so intense that they ate all of the plants out of the study every year. So great for the monarchs. Sonia Altizer will be happy over in ecology, but bad for our images. So these appear to be species that could be seeded into soil that's turned in the fall, and with no other interventions would establish and offer diversity and color in places such as roadsides. could be mixed generally with other grass mixes and still have a chance at establishment and offering ecosystem services much greater than the grass-only mixes. There's also a great potential economic impact with a minimal increase to the seed cost. So as a baseline, a Bermuda seed mix is anywhere from 10 to 15 cents a square foot in application. This adds another 5 to 10 cents, maybe as much as 40 cents, depending on the species you select, to the mix. But the great reduction in cost is if mowing can be reduced because of the greater visual power of the flowering. And in Georgia, in rural parts of Georgia, GDOT mows the roadsides 4 times per year. That's 4 times the entire public roadside. In Metro Atlanta, it's 8 times per year. So if this could be reduced to 1 or 2, then there'd be a great savings and a great reduction in pollution that comes from mowing. So we are now applying these lessons in the design of some new seed mixes to be installed this fall at Exit 6. And that's what you can see here. If you've ever been down to LaGrange, Georgia, this is the Kia plant down to the bottom left here in the image. This section of the highway is called the Ray. And this project is in partnership with the Ray and GDOT. And they are funding a 3-year study to follow the establishment and performance of various mixes. This will fund one of our graduate students for 6 more semesters. And they're calling this exit the Vegetative Lab. And it will include a series of seed mix installations and also slope stabilization approaches using natives over the next few years. And I want to thank Krista Grace with GDOT, Felicity Davis, and also the director of the Ray, Allie Kelly, for their belief and faith in us that we can help create better solutions for the future. And I didn't want to spend any more time. There's too many things to talk about in one presentation, but you may have heard about another facet of Exit 6, which has been our small experimental plot of perennial wheat called Kernza. This is seed from the Land Institute out in Kansas, and they agreed to let the Ray, and by extension CED, be a part of trialing this on the roadside. And it's performing really well. It is behaving like a perennial. It's returned for 2 seasons now and is filling in. It's interesting, it is dormant this time of year. It's just kind of gone to sleep and will reappear later in the winter, like a winter weed essentially, but perennial. And this wheat farming has primarily been the task of my excellent graduate student, Matt Query, and it has earned him stardom as the Kernza farmer, and you might have seen this article featuring him in LAM. So I just want to thank Matt again, and I see him up there. So with that, I'll be glad to take questions, and thanks for listening to me.